All right, everyone, it is time for another edition of everyone's favorite segment, Ask Mike. And as always, our senior analyst, Mike Irwin, is here with me. Mike, let's just jump right into it. Some of these questions are really long, so just bear with me, people.
We're going to have some fun here.
We are going to have some fun.
You need to lighten up here. Just read those long questions and just go with it.
Okay, Red Leg is our first question, who asks, now that the U of A has begun playing all 4 in-state Division I schools in all sports except for football, will we finally get a Razorback versus Red Wolves football game once the schedule permits? And don't you think that game would be a perfect way to end every season the day after Thanksgiving in Little Rock? And maybe someone even comes up with a trophy for it.
Okay. I've gone into this before, and especially on Twitter, some people have come back at me on one of my main points was that if they can just play this game and it can be like a typical non-conference game for Arkansas, that's fine.
Yeah.
I don't have any problem with that. The issue I see is it becoming more than that. That because the fans of Arkansas State and the fans of Arkansas all live here in this state together, they get together, they start getting mad at each other, and all of a sudden it turns into a rivalry. And for Arkansas, you don't need to have a rival with a Sun Belt Conference team. You don't. You need to have rivalries within your own league, and I left this out, and some people have pointed this out. Well, what about Florida State, Florida? They're not in the same conference. I didn't mean to suggest that rivalries have to be with teams in the same conference, but you've got to be on similar footing.
Right.
You know, like Florida State, Florida, situation like that. Here's the issue with a lot of what he said. If you make that a big deal, that's a season-ending game. You've got another one of these trophy things. We got trophies running out our ears. And first of all, they're not. If Arkansas agrees to play that game, they're not going to play it in Little Rock. I promise you that, because they can. That will be a big crowd. Yeah. And you're not going to hold it in a 53,000 seat stadium when you can probably fill up 75,000.
True.
So if they play, it will be played in Fayetteville, not in Little Rock. I'm not in favor of another trophy. And here's the problem again. If it's some deal right at the end of the year and you're making it dramatic and all that, what does that say about where you're at in your conference? Now, in other words, also some people have said, well, that shows that Arkansas needs to worry about getting better in its conference and start having that attitude. Well, yeah, but what do you do in the meantime? Just go ahead and play another team that's not in your conference and make that a big game and just say, well, at some point we'll get competitive in the SEC again. Now, it's going to be 4 or 5 years before this game can be played anyway, because Arkansas's schedule is made out that far in advance. And I had some people talk to me. There's some fans that are really interested in this, and I got some interesting response from people. Like one guy said, okay, how about this? Instead of that, playing Arkansas State and making that a big deal, when this A&M game goes away in Jerry World, how about having a deal where you play Texas every year? That would be a non-conference rival.
Yeah.
Would be now again, I've gotten people say to me, that's in the past. We don't care, the younger fans, we don't care about that. I promise you,
I think people would show up.
If they start playing Texas again every year in Jerry World, it would be much bigger than the A&M game. I know that it would be. So that's an idea of a team out of your conference that would be a big rivalry game every year.
Yeah.
I had another guy say, what about Oklahoma State? If you don't play them in Jerry World, what about having a home and home? They're close to our campus. Yeah. So that would be a non-conference rivalry game. Either of those options would be better, in my opinion, than to develop some sort of rivalry with Arkansas State. And then there's other options. You could have the Jerry World game alternate. Baylor one year, TCU the next year. Those are Dallas area schools.
Interesting.
They'd have their fans there. You're not playing A&M there anymore. You could do that. I think they ought to keep the Jerry World game. I think it's important for recruiting. So whatever they do, to me, that is much more important, what they do with that game, than developing some sort of big deal at the end of the year. Got to make Arkansas State a big game. I'm not trying to disrespect Arkansas State, but they're in another conference. They're not. That conference is not a Power 5 conference. And I promise you, if you tried to sell Tennessee, Memphis as Tennessee's big rival every year, it wouldn't work.
Right.
You know, everybody knows that Tennessee wants to beat Alabama every time they play them. That's one of their rivals. Most schools have more than one that are in the SEC. So that's my position on that. But I would close this answer by saying it doesn't matter what I think, Because Hunter Yurachek will make that decision. He won't have anything to do with what I say.
Well, I'm going to say I agree with you on keeping the Jerry World game. I do think it is important. But Lanny has our next question. He says, I understand it's hard to read the tea leaves about the upcoming season. Arkansas hasn't had any practice with Coach Pittman because of COVID-19. His question is, what must Arkansas focus on to be respected this season other than winning an SEC game, which would obviously help?
I think there needs to be two things that are absolutely most important. Number one, you got to have a starting quarterback that keeps the job. In other words, you don't have a quarterback and you're mentioning 2 or 3 guys going into the first game and we don't know who it is, and then you play a game and you go to somebody else. It's really important, in my opinion, for Felipe Franks to win that job because he's got way more experience than anybody else, and he's the only one on that quarterback on that team that has won SEC games.
Yeah.
You know, and he's won a bunch of them. So I think it would be very important that he would establish himself as the quarterback and know the offense and run it correctly.
Yeah.
You watch the offense and it works because of the quarterback, not in spite of the quarterback. So that's number one. The number two thing is your defense has to attack. What have we seen for 2 years? The last 2 years we saw a defense just kind of sat there and went, okay, come at us. We'll figure out what we're going to do when you come at us.
Yeah.
And then we know what happens. So I think the fans would like to see a defense that attacks, a defense that can sack the quarterback on a regular basis, get thrown for losses in there, TFLs, and be aggressive, don't be passive. So those are the two things I would look for, regardless of how many games you win or don't win.
Our next question comes from Myriad Rocker, and they want to know, do you have a favorite Razorback game moment during the last 10 years? Hard to believe it's been that long already, but for me, it was being in Little Rock and beating LSU to go to the Sugar Bowl.
Yeah, that was the 2010 season, and that would be hard to top over the last 10 years. But I would pick a game earlier that same season, and it wasn't a win. The LSU game was a win. The Alabama game was a 24-20 loss, but it was a close game.
Yeah.
And Arkansas led for most of that game, and it was the loudest noise I've ever heard from an Arkansas crowd in Little Rock or Fayetteville. Anybody that was there that day will tell you the noise level was unbelievable. Now, what does that tell me about our fans? It tells me they're not talking about it openly, but what they really, and we were just talking about this rivalry thing.
Yeah.
What they really want to do is beat Alabama.
Everyone wants to
Big
beat
time.
Alabama. Yeah.
And I'm telling you, if you get to the point 2-3 years into this Sam Pittman era where you beat them, I mean, he could be elected president. Just declare Arkansas an independent state. He's the president of Arkansas, because it would be that big of a deal to beat Alabama. So that's the biggest game in the last 10 years, even though it was a loss. And in the next 10 years, that's going to be the biggest game, is if and when, how does it happen, and what's the situation, and when do you actually beat Alabama, especially if Nick Saban is still the coach. They want to beat Nick Saban.
That would be something if that actually happened. The next question is from Old Hog. He asks, if Felipe Franks is the starting quarterback next year, as expected, and has a successful year for the Razorbacks, what are the chances that he would apply for a medical hardship because of the 2019 season, in which he played only 3 games due to the injury and returned to Arkansas for the 21 season? Yeah,
that's a really good question, and most people haven't even thought about it. What generally happens in a situation like that is the guy's going to come back if he has the perception that it will increase his draft stock. If he has a good enough year this fall for Arkansas that he feels like he'll do well in the draft, he's gone.
Right.
But if it's just sort of a good year and Arkansas is sort of good, but you can see a lot of promise for the next year, yeah, he might come back thinking, hey, my second year in this offense, I'll be really good, and then maybe I up my draft stock. So, yeah, it could happen. It'll be a while before we know that.
Swine American says, I saw your answer to my question last week about the media and fan access, or lack thereof, to watch practice. He says it was not a very satisfying answer, so let me rephrase the question. Who should a fan call or write asking why the media or fans can't get into film and or watch some benign July or August preseason practice sessions? Years ago, you could contact Rick Schaefer and get an answer. Watching the video on the official website simply just does not cut it. It looks like a cheap propaganda film. I keep going on this one. Remember, I and fans like me are on your side when it comes to access. You don't have to be Jim Lindsay to attend a Houston Nutt or Bobby Petrino practice. They won more than they lost. And by contrast, Brett Bielema and Chad Morris kept practice so off limits that Area 51 access was easier. This is a great question. And let us not forget, they lost a whole lot more than they won.
Well, actually, Brett Bielema probably had the most open policy in season of anybody because he actually would let fans go to the first fall August camp scrimmage.
Oh, that's true, yeah.
He did that, and nobody else has ever done that. So I go back to my answer again because I just think it's important. He rephrased his question, but I'm not rephrasing this part of my answer because it's just the way it is. With this COVID stuff going on, whatever Sam Pittman's policy is right now, it may not have anything to do with his long-term policy.
Yeah.
They're just trying to figure out a way, and with this outbreak in Washington County, everybody's worried about what's going to happen if that goes with the football team. So right now, they're going to keep people away from there. And it may happen all the way through August camp. We don't know. If there's a change, we'll pass that along. Now, you can call Kyle Parkinson, the SID, and he might be able to get an answer for you. But I'm guessing that right now, Sam Pittman's attitude is, I'll worry about stuff like that later. I'll also say this. It's becoming increasingly common for schools around the country, and certainly SEC schools, and I talk to people that cover other SEC teams, that coaches are getting more where they close things down.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing comes and goes, but I know years ago when I first started, Frank Broyles was an exception. He was pretty open to the media, but he wasn't open to fans. And then it kind of got to where it was open a little bit, and it closed more, it kind of went back and forth. But let me give you a good example of why coaches generally don't want fans and even the media in their practices. Under Jack Crow, who was a very open type coach, he let us go to their whole practice, the media, and he even let some fans in there. He greeted us at the bottom of the elevator one day before practice. And they just lost their starting quarterback to an injury, and they were playing A&M in the last regular season game. If they win that game, they go to the Cotton Bowl. If they don't, A&M goes. So it was a big game, and he's just lost his starting quarterback. So he's at the bottom of the elevator, and he says, guys, you're going to see something today that you cannot report. You cannot tell anybody about it. Don't tell your wives, your friends.
Yeah.
Shut up about this. And he said, we are going to take one of our defensive backs, who was a good option quarterback in high school, and we're going to let him run the option this week, and we're going to surprise A&M. Because it's really the only chance we got is to hit them with some sort of surprise. Because if we try to run our regular offense with a backup quarterback, we're going to lose. So we didn't report any of that, and they went through their practices all week, and we thought it might work, but it didn't work. It looked like A&M was ready for them from the first play, and Arkansas just got pulverized. So Jack Crow tells us the following Monday, A&M knew. He didn't explain how he knew they knew, but he said they knew.
They knew.
And he said, I'm going to rethink this whole thing with you guys. Because he said, obviously somebody talked, and he said, I can't have something like that. So we were like, well, gee, I don't know. Who did it?
Yeah.
He comes back about 2 days later and has a meeting with us, and he apologizes. Because what happened was one of his own managers did it. His teams, student managers got to jawing with a friend of his who was a student manager at Texas A&M, and it all came out, and then he goes and tells the Aggie coaches, and it's all blown up. My point is, it is so hard to keep things secret in season. And again, answering this specific question, I will say that there is a huge difference typically in the access you get in the spring. He mentioned benign, what did he say, benign?
July and August practices.
There's no benign practices once you're preparing for the season.
Yeah.
You're running the stuff you're going to run in games. So coaches generally are more restrictive at that time of year than they are in the spring. The spring is where we typically got more access, and it's where fans have typically been allowed to see more. But again, I don't know what Pittman's going to do. And he may be more open, and he may not, but we will find out eventually.
Yeah, his focus is definitely on his team right now.
Right.
Alabama Hog says, Coach Bielema is suing the Razorback Foundation for breach of contract. Do you think it'll go to court? Do you think the Razorback Foundation has a chance to prevail, or will there be an out-of-court settlement? We've talked about this a little bit.
I've always thought there would be a settlement. trying to, I don't know exactly what happened here. But, we know what the release was from the foundation. And they said that I think what was it?
They had paid him over $4 million.
$4.5 million or something. They paid him approximately $4.5 million and then determined that he wasn't making a good effort to get a similar type job. So they stopped paying him. And it just sat there for a long time. Didn't go anywhere. He didn't complain, they weren't paying him, and we didn't know what was going to happen. And then all of a sudden he files this lawsuit. Well, what they say is that he filed that lawsuit after they had sent him a notice asking him to give that money back, or they were going to sue him. So it sounds like what happened here is that Bielema was sort of willing to accept it the way it was.
Right.
But when they want their money back, he's like, wait a minute. Now, interesting that there was a thing on social media that showed this house that he and his wife have just purchased in Florida. It's on the beach. It's like $2.5 million or whatever.
It's pretty nice.
If he's already bought this thing and paid cash for it, now he has to give back $4 million. I don't know what's going to happen there. So he may be motivated by the fact that suddenly we want our $4 million back, and it's like, are you kidding me? I'm going to sue you. All of that suggests a settlement to me. To me, if you're a smart lawyer, you go in there and go, we gave you 4.5. We were supposed to give you 12. Will you just take 4.5?
Right.
And he
Just
might go,
call
okay.
it a day.
You pay for the lawyers, and we'll call it. Call it even.
We'll have to wait and see what
but
happens.
I don't know
with
if that's what happens. That's just what I think.
Muskogee Hog fan says Alabama lost 16 players to the NFL, including their QB, 3 O-linemen, 4 receivers, and 7 from their defense. LSU lost 14, including their QB and 4 O-linemen. Auburn lost 4 O-linemen and 4 DBs. Mississippi State lost 14, including 3 O-linemen, 2 linebackers, and 3 DBs. How do you think this may potentially affect the outcomes of their season and therefore the possible outcome of the Hogs season?
Yeah, he sent me a whole spreadsheet where I could go look at all of those different schools and the players they lost to the NFL. And it is pretty interesting. Let me just say this, going all the way back to when I was in high school and college, I was one of these guys that would get all these preseason magazines at the drugstore and read them all and look at the preseason polls. And what struck me all the way back then was how wrong they usually were. You go back when the season was over and read one of these magazines, and you go, well, they didn't know what they were talking about. And what often happens is, whatever a team does one year, everybody just says, oh yeah, they'll probably be good. This team finished second in the conference last year, they'll probably finish second or third again.
Yeah.
And they don't take into consideration who they're losing and what positions they're losing people at.
Yeah.
And that's where this comes in. Because if you look at it, all of those schools he mentioned are going to have some key losses. Now here's what I think. I think Alabama and LSU recruit so well that it doesn't matter who they lost. They're still going to beat Arkansas. But I would look specifically at Auburn and Mississippi State because they have some big losses. And you might look at those 2 games with that in mind and say, you know what, we might win one of those 2 games, might win them both, because they are going to be having to replace a lot of key players, especially when you lose a lot of offensive linemen. So we'll see how that works, but looking at that might give Razorback fans a little kind of a ray of hope that there's some SEC teams in there that some people think they can't beat this year that they might just beat.
You never know what'll happen. 3-10 wants to know, if the players have some sort of protest in the stadium at game time, are the powers that be prepared if some fools in the stand start a counter protest? I pray it'll not happen, but we do live in difficult times.
Okay, I think that's pretty overly dramatic. First of all, I seriously doubt there's going to be a protest before a game. I don't know what kind of protest he's talking about.
Maybe he's talking about kneeling.
Well, the protest that they went to was obviously on the downtown square, and Sam Pittman went with them. I think that's about as far as this is going to go. If he is talking about the kneeling, that's not an issue because I think it's pretty much universal, but I know at Arkansas, the team doesn't take the field until after the national anthem has been played.
Right.
So that would never come up.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure the NFL's not going to adopt that policy to get away from some huge controversy. And I just can't see any sort of protest. Somebody comes out holding a sign or something and holding, and the fans are in the stands getting mad. I don't see that happening. Now look, In basketball season, that could be an issue because they are on the court when the national anthem is played. We know that. And it came up with women's basketball a few years ago. And the coach ended up getting fired. He defended the girls that took a knee afterward, then had to change his mind. And I know that Mike Anderson made it very clear right after that, we're not having anybody that take a knee. So I don't know if Musselman would have to deal with something like this or not, but it would be much more likely to happen in basketball because they have to stand out there while the national anthem is being played.
Delta Boy says the Texas governor announced 50% capacity restrictions for this foreseeable future. How bad will revenue be if this stands?
You know, in one of these Zoom interviews that Hunter Yurachek did with us, he went over that. He created a budget that was based on approximately 30 to 35,000 season tickets being sold, and that would be about 50% capacity. So they've already budgeted in a budget that would carry them through the next academic year based on that many people at football games. SEC teams are much less likely to be hurt by whatever lost revenue there is, whatever this formula ends up being, 40%, 60%, 30%. They're much less likely to be hurt by that loss of revenue and the loss of revenue that already occurred when those spring sports
were canceled,
and especially the NCAA tournament, because that's a big chunk lost. They're much less likely to be hurt than teams in other conferences because they make so much money off their TV revenue. So I think they'll be okay for this year. Hopefully it won't be an issue next year.
Let's hope not. Cowhog32 wants to know, assuming college athletics return to normal, what do you see happening first? The football team winning 6 or more games and going bowling, basketball team making it to the Sweet 16, or baseball team winning the World Series?
Whew.
That's
a tough one. You know, I'm not sure about Arkansas's pitching. That's what I'm not sure about next year. I'm not sure they have the pitching to win the national championship. I think they'll be good.
They'll be good.
But I don't know if the pitching will carry them through. It might. But when I start asking myself about Musselman and what he's going to do with this team, I could see Sweet 16 is really you make it to the second weekend of the tournament. You win 2 games, you're in the Sweet 16. So I could see them doing that. A lot easier than I can predict somebody's going to win a national championship, which the College World Series is tough. I mean, you got to make it to the championship series, and then you got to win that series. We all know how close they came and didn't win it. And so I'm not saying they won't win a national championship, but to talk about Sweet 16 for basketball, I think is a lot easier accomplished. So I'll go with that.
You think easier than winning 6 games for football?
I still think it's going to be tough to win 6 games in football next year.
Old Fart asks, who is your favorite assistant football coach to interview and why?
Oh, that's easy, and that's Sam Pittman. He was the offensive line coach here. He reminded me of Danny Ford. Of course, Danny Ford was a head coach, but Danny would come in after practice, and like he had bad knees, and he couldn't sit. He had to sit down some during practice anyway. But when he would go over to his office where it was air conditioned, and he would take his shoes off, and he'd prop his feet up, and he'd just sit there and talk, and it was a bull session. And it was very informal, and we all enjoyed it. Well, Sam Pittman did that, only he was an assistant coach. And he would come in after practice to that, we call it, what do we call that, the dungeon?
The dungeon down there.
Yeah, it's like way down in the basement, and it's this little room with little kiddie desks. It looked like we sit in these like we're in the 3rd grade again. And so we're all there, and he'd come down there, and he'd just, man, it's hot out there. And then he'd take his shoes off, and then he'd take his socks off,
relax a little
and
bit.
he'd prop his feet up, and he'd just sit back and take questions from us. And there wasn't hardly anything he wouldn't answer. He wouldn't give you this, oh, off the record, is this off the record? He just, if he didn't want to answer, he wouldn't do it. But he's just very easy, open, approachable, always got a smile on his face. Sam Pittman reminds me of a guy you would want to be your next door neighbor. Yeah. Because we all at times have bad next door neighbors. You would want him as your next door neighbor because he'd be a good guy. So he's my favorite. And I'm telling you, the word is spreading everywhere. This is why he's able to get recruits. This is why his staff loves him. And the more people realize what this guy is, Hunter Yurachek is going to end up looking like a genius before this is over for hiring this guy, I believe.
Well, Lanny is back with another question. He asks, did Reggie Chaney entering the transfer portal surprise you? And what was the issue there?
It didn't surprise me. You know, there was talk that he was probably, he might be gone after right before Mike Anderson was fired. I was hearing stuff he might leave.
Yeah.
And then Anderson was fired and Musselman came in and then he decided to stay. Reggie's always looked, I think this guy's got talent. I really do. I don't know why he's been inconsistent.
Yeah.
But he's always looked to me like he was a little bit uncomfortable in his situation. Even after Musselman got here, he looked that way. He just didn't look like he fit, like he felt like he fit. He was up and down his first year. He was up and down this year. He had some good games middle of the year, but then he really kind of just disappeared down the stretch in those last few games.
Yeah.
And other players that had been beneath him on the bench surpassed him. And then he also had some off the court issues that I think were a factor. So look, the minute we realized that they'd gotten over the limit of scholarships, then you've only got two choices if you're thinking about this. Either Isaiah Joe's not coming back.
Right.
And that takes care of it. Or if he comes back, then somebody has to leave. To me, what this shows with Chaney leaving is Isaiah Joe's probably going to stay.
That would be something if he comes back for another year at Arkansas. That team is pretty stacked right now. But Arkansas Redneck says, Arkansas got commitments from 3 big-time offensive players last week, a receiver, a quarterback, and a running back. Which one will have the biggest impact for Arkansas?
Whew.
You going with A.J. Green?
I am. I'm trying to think here. You know, all 3 of those guys are good.
Yeah.
But Green from Tulsa Union, let me look at this list of offers. That's what I was looking down at.
He had a bunch. Actually, all 3 of them had a bunch of
Yeah,
offers.
but these are the schools that offered him, and these are just some of them. Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, South Carolina, LSU, Michigan, Texas, Tennessee, Texas A&M, and it goes on and on.
Yeah.
If you think about it, for this kid to pick Arkansas that went 4-20 over the last 2 years over any of those teams, much less all of them,
Yeah.
there wasn't one of those teams that he looked at and said, oh man, I'd rather go there than Arkansas. What that tells me is this coaching staff has done a good job of convincing athletes we're not going to stay down.
Yeah.
We're going to get big. And in this particular case, he's being described by people that have watched him play or watched his video as being having Darren McFadden-like speed and Felix Jones moves.
Yeah. Not a bad combo.
If that turns out to be true, he would end up being the best running back of all time at Arkansas. I don't know if that's going to happen, but what I do know is that he does really have legitimate big-time speed, and he does have moves. And what I noticed in watching his high school video is that if somebody misses one tackle on him, he's gone.
Yeah.
He just spurts past into the secondary and splits people.
Guy's fast.
It's a guy here and guy there, zoop, right between them. They misjudge how fast he is, and he's gone. So he's going to be coming in right at a time when Rakeem Boyd is gone, and they need a feature back. So it seems to be really good timing for this kid, too. It's something to really get excited about, I think. But all 3 of those guys are impressive.
Yeah. That's going to do it for our Ask Mike this week. As always, Mike Irwin, thank you so much. If you have any questions, let Mike know on hogville.net. But that's going to do it for this week. We'll see you back here next Monday.